Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hi, I'm Kevin Vost with a new gift-giving idea. Are you trying to convince someone that God really does exist and that God really does care about them? Do you wish you could just hand someone a book that would prove God really does love them and that he really wants to be their friend? Well, there's a book out now that does just that. To find it, Google this title, Tony's 50,000 Co-incidence Miracles. You'll find it instantly. Just Google Tony's 50,000 Co-incidence Miracles. That's Tony's 50,000 Co-incidence Miracles.
We are on page 46 now, and we are going to start reading about the forest miracle. I had received a wonderful response from our great God, whom I had mistreated and offended terribly with my stupid and rude attitude. And God had managed to still send me a miracle job with a large raise, where the recruiter mysteriously said he could not reveal his source on how he located me. I still wonder if an angel called the recruiter with my name, like the angel Raphael helped Tobias in the Bible in Tobit chapter 3. I had dropped my other part-time job, and school was getting easier, or maybe I was getting smarter because of the wisdom of God that he was granting me. I was actually doing well in handling courses like accounting, biology, and law, all in the same evening division semester. And I started to do another thing. I started to go for a walk in a nearby forest for about 15 minutes a day near my job at lunchtime. I would walk and talk with God about things like the Bible, which I had read just before bedtime the night before, and I would talk to God about the morning mass lectures, the homilies, which the priests give at the daily morning masses. I was really enjoying attending each morning mass and learning a lot from the priest's lecture homilies each morning. I think I had been doing this for about a month in the same spot in the forest each day, whenever I could do so, almost daily, except when the boss needed me to take a shorter lunch during some busy periods. And then it happened. One day, when I entered the forest to walk and talk with God, and after I had gotten a bit deeper into the forest, everything just stopped, and it suddenly got very quiet. I was standing still in a dead silence, and I felt as if I was surrounded by a vast, infinite presence of God who was everywhere. Yes, everywhere. And even way beyond where I could see with my naked eyes. Everything had stopped. You know, like all the noise of the forest, it just stopped. The wind in the trees, the birds chirping, and the sounds of the small animals like squirrels and rabbits, and even all the insects. Everything was very, very quiet. This forest was next to a major highway, too, so the total stillness and quietness was impossible, except that God was making it happen. I felt loved and cared for and in the presence of a huge, powerful force which I sensed was just looking at me and studying me. The peace was very welcoming and comfortable. I never wanted to leave. But after about 5 minutes, it stopped, and all the noise was back, and it was time to go back to work after lunch. I know I was changed in that time in that forest, and I remember it every time I see the passage in the Bible in Genesis 28, where Jacob realized that he was in a similar forest place, where Jacob just somehow knew that God was there. Jacob called that place Bethel, translated as House of God. I believe that, like Jacob, I too felt the presence of God in a forest that day. It was an unforgettable, life-changing experience, granted by a very great and infinite loving God. This taught me to be more aware of God's vastness and what being in His presence must feel like. Although I am positive that I only experienced a tiny part of God's presence, and for a very short time, nonetheless, it was both very powerful and very peaceful at the same time. I felt God's presence there like what I imagine Jacob must have felt many centuries ago when he sensed God in a forest as well. This sensation miracle and the earlier one about getting a new job with a 30% raise finally convinced me that God was indeed befriending me and loving me. I was absolutely sure of that now for sure. Here's what Jacob said in the Bible when he felt God's presence in the forest long, long ago. In Genesis 28, he said, "And Jacob was afraid and said, 'How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven.'" The next miracle is a beautiful experience. It's called the He and I book. That's He, meaning God, the He and I book. Let's begin. We're on page 49. After a few years of growing closer to God and learning more and more about Him, I found I could talk to God and hear God too. Like phases 1 and 2 explained earlier in the book, where we were talking about talking to God at the closet, which was phase 1, and then having conversations with God, which is phase 2. But doubts also began to confuse me. I kept having the good experience of following what God told me to do in my job, in my daily routines, but some of my family and friends began to pull away from me as treating me as a thing called a Jesus freak, meaning I was so concentrated on Jesus that I didn't fit in anymore in other discussions. So these people, did not want to talk with me unless they had to, because they kept trying to avoid talking about God. Then, too, I believe the devil tried to derail me with a lot of doubts, especially whenever doing God's will at work did not always match what the boss wanted me to do. So it became a little difficult trying to do God's will when the people around you didn't see it that way or didn't want to hear about or participate in what I was doing. So, like many other people in history, I entered into a dry spell where I wondered if I was really hearing God speak to me in my heart and conscience, or if I was often just imagining a lot of these inspirations in my own head. I had not learned all about the 3 phases of talking to God, which are explained in chapter 2 above. I was still learning a lot about it all at this point, which I really did not fully understand. It seemed to work well, and I thought that I was seeing good results from the closet talking method, and I had gotten a lot of wisdom by talking to God often, but sometimes I would wonder if it was only my imagination. I thought maybe I was only talking to myself when I thought I was talking to God. That is how the devil has been killing the faith of believers ever since the very beginning. He uses doubts to make us doubt ourselves and doubt God and doubt that God is talking to us. The devil even tricked Adam and Eve to doubt God's words in the Garden of Eden. So after a long period of doubting, I began to doubt God was really talking to me at all. Sometimes it would be clear that God was talking to me because of the results, the miracles, which would show up in a few minutes, or maybe in an hour, but the miracles would show up. And if the results took a few days to occur, well, then I would begin to doubt it was God's voice. Mind you, I was still learning all of this process, and I had no one really to talk to in those days. There were not a lot of spiritual people who could explain this phenomenon, although I had tried. Then, because of the doubts, I got sluggish, and I stopped seeking directions and messages from God. And that is the beginning of the end for a life with God. Faith disappears when we stop trying to seek for His directions in our life. If we stop talking to God, we slowly begin to forget He is there, and that is another devil trick to keep us from talking to God. I'm told that many of the saints in history had these doubtful moments in their lives too. It seems this is a time where God tests us and shows us how weak our faith really is, so that once we see our weakness, He can then help us to grow stronger. God gets our attention during this testing phase by showing us that we can't overcome evil and the devil's tricks without God's help. I find that when these doubting and testing phases come to us in life, that we need to keep asking Jesus to please help us to unravel what is going on. And He always does clarify things for us if we do that. In the end, after we get through this testing phase, we find our faith in Jesus is stronger than it ever was before. We're on page 52 now. 52. Well, one winter night, while I was still struggling with this doubting phase of my life at about 7 p.m., and while I was co-hosting a birthday party with my wife for our son and his Cub Scout group, I sensed Jesus nudging me to leave the house and drive off to a local church about 4 miles away. Jesus wanted me to come and speak with Him, and it felt pretty clear that He wanted me to come right now. I began to use the number 2 level phase of talking to God by this time, and so I said, in my mind and in my heart, I said, "Dear Jesus, the church is always locked up at 3 p.m. each day, and I know that that's the case." But His inner voice got very convincing. Although it was still kind and gentle and non-threatening, I felt Jesus wanted me to come to that church for some reason, and it felt like a friend was saying, "Please come." So I sheepishly went to my wife to explain, imagining that she would say she needed me to help her with the 5 young Cub Scouts who were about to finish eating their cake just now. But fortunately for me, I had married a saint. She looked at me for a moment with a very loving and understanding look, and she simply said, "Okay, Tony, go ahead. This is not a problem. I'm doing okay." My wife, Julie, was a saint and a great blessing from God in my life, and she had a great faith in sensing God's will for her and us in many ways that differed from mine, but when she sensed that God was telling her things, she was always right about them. So off I went now to the church, which, by the way, I still knew they locked up at 3 p.m. every day, a point I kept reminding myself of as I drove the 4 miles it took to get there. And yes, my state of doubting that I was hearing Jesus was getting worse as I drove over. This was a winter night. It was dark. It was about 8 p.m. at this point, and I knew they closed the church at 3 p.m. Somehow I began to realize that this whole event was going to be a great test of God tonight, a test which I did not manufacture or create. I had been given a beckoning message from God, which I was just about to prove or disprove. What I mean is that now, if the church was all locked up, then that proved God was not calling me. Indeed, this was going to be a good test, because if God was calling me to the church, then the church would have to be unlocked. And there would be something happening there to confirm that Jesus did in fact want me to show up there late at night like this, although I knew the place was locked at 3 p.m. So now I realized this was a very good test but set up by God, not by me. P.S. My realization was really, God is inspiring me to know this. So when I got to the church and got out of my car in a very dark parking lot, I pulled on the main door of the church and found it was locked. I was extremely annoyed. I felt stupid that I drove over in the first place, and I felt that I had just proved that indeed Jesus was not talking to me at all ever. Boy, was I angry, and I was sure now that God had never talked to me at all in all those years where I really thought it was God. I felt like a jerk that had been stupidly imagining things for a very long time. I felt those people who did not believe my faith, well, they must have been right all these years. As I angrily walked back to my car, I heard that same Jesus voice within me saying, "But you have not tried all the doors to see if there is just possibly one door open." I thought, are you kidding? There were 6 doors around a very large church building, and it was very dark, and I could see the priest's residence next door, so I wondered if they would call the police if they saw me poking around at this late hour. I sure did not want to tell a priest that Jesus told me to come here, so that the priest had to come and open up the door for me right now. I realized that if I did not check all the doors personally, I would never be sure if I was called here to the church tonight or not. I mean, if all the doors were locked, then Jesus could not have really called me to visit here, and that would prove that I was not hearing his voice the way the Catechism says we can in article number 1777 of the Catechism. So I did go around to all the doors, and door after door I got more and more annoyed and hopeless. I reached the final door, which was like a door used to toss small packages inside. It was never really used by anyone that I knew at the church because it was a very small door. I grabbed the door handle and pulled really, really hard in anger at this last door because I reasoned that all those past wonderful moments where I thought God was talking to me all these years were apparently really just only my imagination. Can you imagine how heartbreaking that was? Because all the doors so far were locked up. I was sad and felt stupid and wondered, how did I let all of this confusion ever happen to me? I was successful in my job, I had graduated college with good grades, and here I am, just a jerk after all, imagining all these things for so long. So fully expecting that this last door was also locked, I pulled the door handle really, really hard and fast in anger because I imagined it was locked. However, the door was not locked, and I almost knocked my nose off. I pulled the doorknob so hard and fast, and I did not get my nose out of the way. All of my feelings of frustration and sadness, combined with the darkness and the cold night, all came together at that last door, door number 6 now, and caused me to pull it hard because I was tired and frustrated and cold and sad. We are on page 56. The next thing I noticed was that I was inside the church, and the door made an awful slamming sound as if I was in a metal drum and the metal door had just slammed shut. It all happened so quickly that one minute I was outside and suddenly now I was inside, and I did not really notice the transition. I think perhaps that I must have just jumped inside when the door opened, like I was accustomed to do every day on the train and the subway in New York City when those doors opened there. Anyway, I was inside now, and the door slammed shut, and I heard something moving around in this very, very dark church. I had no idea what was moving, but it sounded like something or someone rushing away from me as I had just suddenly landed inside. I froze there for a moment, wondering if I should move at all. Then, after what seemed to be a very, very long time of me being frozen there in fear, I began to quietly reach for and feel for the light switch, which took a really long time to find in this deep darkness. Then finally, with my hand on the light switch, I began to focus my eyes and train my eyes so I would be ready to see whatever I could see quickly, and as soon as I turned on the lights. I figured that I might have to move really fast as soon as I turned on the lights, because then I would see what had rushed away from me as I entered the church. I was like an athlete at the starting line of a race, ready to turn on the lights and then immediately decide to run or jump or drop and roll immediately, and just as soon as I turned on the lights. I had to be ready to react quickly as soon as I turned on the lights, because I didn't know what was lurking there in the darkness. So I got myself ready to act quickly. I trained my eyes to be focused on the darkness, but to look straight ahead in the direction of the noise which I had heard in that space earlier. Now I was ready to see whatever it was that moved as soon as I turned on the light switch. I took a deep breath, and I flipped the light switch on, and the darkness was gone, and now, right in front of my nose, was a book rack with only one book on the top shelf. It was directly where my eyes were trained to watch for any activity. Nothing else was moving, and then that same quiet voice of Jesus, which I was used to hearing by now, said, "Take the book and look at it." I don't know why, but I did not doubt that voice at that moment at all. The voice was familiar. It was peaceful, polite, and somehow very convincing. So I took the book in my hands to open it up at random to see what I might see. I opened it at random, and my eyes immediately noticed one line in the middle of the page which I had just opened too. And that line stated, "Jesus said, 'Why do you doubt that you hear my voice? Don't you realize that I talk to all of my creatures?'" I had opened that book at random. Something had directed my 2 thumb nails to that exact page. The book's title was He and I. It was a true story and a diary of Gabrielle Bosses, a female actress in Europe in the 1940s. In her book, she lists her daily conversations with Jesus on every page. Jesus was asking her, on this particular page, Jesus was asking her, "Why do you doubt my voice?" The whole experience from start to finish was like a Hollywood script. I was in a dark church. I had 6 doors to check, and only the last one was open. And the book was there in front of my nose as I turned the lights on. Then I open it at random to the page that says, "Why do you doubt that you hear my voice?" Wow. I mean, wow. I was absolutely convinced at that moment that Jesus is absolutely my friend and my God, too. He has taught me since then that he does talk to all of us, hourly, as the Catechism states in Articles 1776 and 1777. We're on page 59. We're going to start talking about the new heart miracle. Once again, it's called the new heart miracle. Let us begin. Jesus woke me from a sound sleep at 3 o'clock in the morning and inspired me to get up and go downstairs to the kitchen and write a letter to a man who was having heart surgery in the morning. The man was a close relative, and my wife would be going to visit him in the morning, but I could not be there until later in the day. I asked Jesus if I could wait until later, since if I get up at 3 a.m., I will probably never fall back to sleep. Funny, Jesus lovingly convinced me to go down to do it now for some reason. So I rolled over and got up and went down into the kitchen. My wife and 3 children were sound asleep. I asked Jesus to inspire me with what to write. And Jesus nudged me and prompted me, as if I was at the closet talking to him, asking for advice in the morning. Jesus inspired me to write some of what it says in Psalm 51. For example, Psalm 51 says, "Create in me a new heart, O Lord." Well, that made a lot of sense because the man was going to have heart surgery that very morning, so I began to write, intending to write something like, "I am praying for you and praying that God will create a brand new heart for you during surgery later today, so that you will be stronger and better than ever by the end of this day." But Jesus, as I wrote the words, created a brand new heart. Well, just then, Jesus had me hear the record player in the living room went on. It just started up and started to play all by itself, and I heard the record drop into place on the turntable, and then I heard the turntable begin to turn, swoosh, 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 and I heard the arm with the needle settle on the record being played, and then I heard the most wonderful words being sung, which were as follows, "Create in me a new heart, O Lord." Wow. I mean, wow. The record was singing the same exact words which I had just written down. Wow. You see, we had such a record which we listened to often, where the vocalist sings the words to Psalm 51, which are, "Create a new heart in me, O God." I immediately got up to check and see who had played this trick on me and put that record on while I was writing the exact same words in the kitchen. But as I got up and went to check, Jesus spoke in my heart again and made me realize that nobody but He alone would know my thoughts at 3 a.m. to trick me by putting the record on. I did check, though, and did find all 3 children were asleep, and my wife was also sleeping. So I felt the clear and wonderful, amazing presence of God with me there in this truly spectacular moment. Imagine, He asked me to write certain words, and the record player went on and sung the same words in the other room. I felt that same peaceful presence of God which I had experienced in the forest earlier, as explained above in the forest miracle. The heart surgery was a great success, and the man lived for another 13 years. Thank you, Jesus. We are on page 61 now, and we're going to begin to talk about the marble slab miracle. Let us begin. I was out of work for about 18 months, and I was following all the great advice of the experts from outplacement firms who tutor job seekers on what to do. And yet I was not getting any job offers. I was spending a lot of time visiting Jesus in the church before and after my job interviews, and I was praying a lot, and I got to know Jesus pretty well in that time of closeness and dependency on Him. One day, as I was inside a Catholic church asking God what I did well or not well at a recent job interview, and what was to become of me and my family if I did not land the job soon, I felt His loving assurance that He was going to make it all work out and that I needed to trust Him more. Then, as I was walking down the side aisle of the church, His inner voice spoke to me, His inner voice which is alive in our consciences, as the Catechism article number 1777 already explained above. Jesus said, "Sit here." I looked down at the seat, which Jesus meant, but it was only a half of a seat, at the very end of a pew. You know, that place where the pew meets the very high marble stone pillars which hold up the roof, so that carpenters have to cut half the seat off in order to allow people to slide in and out of the pew as they squeeze by the stone pillar. I marveled at why Jesus wanted me to sit there with my knees touching the marble pillar, and I jokingly told Jesus that I hope nobody comes in and sees me crunched here in this tiny space with my knees touching the pillar, because they would certainly think I was very strange and maybe even think that I was nuts, squeezed here on the end of a pew up against the marble pillar. This was a very large church, and there were many more wonderful places to sit than crunched and squeezed in here, balanced on one half of a seat, facing a marble pillar. I was certainly thinking, as the Bible says, God's ways are not our ways. Then Jesus said, "Look." So I looked at what I could, but the only thing that made sense was to look at the marble slab in front of my nose, which was also touching my knees. And I was astonished. Right there in front of my nose was a marble slab with the curvy, scribbled lines of the usual marble grainwork that is present in marble, which is, normal to see. But these curvy lines formed a picture, a painting, painted by God. Painted by God, who had formed this marble slab in some mountain someplace over some period of perhaps 5,000 years. I realized that when marble is cut and quarried from mountains of stone, that the marble stone grains have been formed for centuries of fallen dead trees and rain and mud and soot, all being compressed under great pressure for centuries, compressed in order to form marble grain lines in the stone. It has to be a miracle that people actually do cut a slab of marble and create a drawing too. The drawing itself has to be understood as a creative miracle because God arranged for the grain lines to form over many centuries, many centuries of pressure under the earth. And then God guided the sawing equipment and the hands of the artisans who did cut the slab at which I was looking. Jesus also inspired me to realize that during the quarrying process of creating slabs of marble, the position of the slicing and cutting equipment really determines what drawing we will see on the marble slab later on. If the cutting is only off by 1/64th of an inch, higher or lower, it produces a totally different picture on the slab of marble. So God somehow also had to guide the hands of those people who were cutting the slabs of marble in order for this particular slab to depict the artwork which God intended us to see. What I saw very clearly was a painting, painted with God's marble grain markings. The godly painting was a painting of the Blessed Virgin Mary riding on a horse, with Saint Joseph, her spouse, walking alongside, and with the baby Jesus lying across Mary's lap on his stomach. The slab of marble conveyed a clear picture of the actual time where the Holy Family left Israel for Egypt during the time when King Herod was out killing all of the male children born during the time of the Magi visit, as follows, as it says in Matthew chapter 2. And here's what it says. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there till I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. Well, I was stunned, of course, but I was made certain in that moment that Jesus truly loved me, because he had granted me this private viewing of his artwork created in the marble. My fears about getting a job were completely destroyed because I remembered that Jesus had told me a few minutes earlier not to worry, because he was going to make the job situation work out for me soon. And now this marble miracle arrived to remind and assure me that Jesus had always been a wonderful, loving friend to me and pulled me through a lot of problems already in life. I have taken many people to this church to view the wonderful artwork whenever Jesus nudged me to do so. And I have shown it to the pastor and to the sexton at the church too. The pastor wisely asked me not to publicize the whereabouts of the marble drawing because of the commotions or break-ins that this might cause. I do have a picture of the artwork, however, to show to interested spirit-filled souls when they ask for it. Thank you, Jesus, for this amazing gift and this amazing memory. Please see Exhibit I in the Exhibits section of this book for the photo of the marble slab and for a tracing of the marble grain lines, which helps us to see the artwork of God a bit more easily after seeing the tracing.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCA.